Citing growing northern aggression from Russia and China, the federal government has unveiled a new Arctic foreign policy, combining diplomacy and defense goals in a vision for guarding Canada's sovereignty.
Our government is going to, by necessity, invest billions of dollars into our Arctic. And we need this work to be guided by our foreign policy, because defense policy is an extension of foreign policy, and it provides us with the diplomatic tools that we will need to assert our sovereignty and to maintain peace, stability, and prosperity in the region.
The new measures announced today include appointing an Arctic ambassador and opening 2 new consulates, one in Alaska and one in Greenland. There's almost $35 million for startup costs and $7 million in continuing years, but that excludes the tens of billions already announced in defense investments and the cost of future investments to reach the policy's security goals. Mélanie Joly is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and she joins me now. Minister, it's good to see you. Thanks for being here today.
Good to see you, David.
You've extensively cited Russian and Chinese aggression today in launching this policy, but can you be a bit less abstract? How immediate of a threat do you believe those countries are to Canada's safety and sovereignty?
So I don't think the Arctic will be the primary theater of conflict. But I think, though, that it will be impacted by all the conflicts that you're seeing in the world. And more you're seeing what is happening in Europe, in Ukraine, is linked to what is happening in the Middle East, because Iran is selling drones and ballistic missiles to Russia. And it is also linked to what's going on in Asia, with the DPRK troops now going and fighting in Europe. And also China enabling Russia through its economic and diplomatic support for its war in Ukraine. And so that's why we have to change our focus, our perspective when it comes to the Arctic. We need to be pragmatic, we need to be realist, and we need to understand that it's no longer a low-tension region. And indeed, like you were saying, Russia and China are working together, and China is allowed by Russia to even work more in the Arctic, because ultimately Russia is deploying a lot of resources in Ukraine and needs help.
Right. So, but explain to me how their activity in the Arctic is a threat to Canadian sovereignty. Like, what is the imminent threat to the Canadian territorial and economic interests and political interests that you are trying to solve with this?
So 3 things. First, short term, we're seeing activities by foreign states that are approaching northern communities. And that's a real problem, because we know that China has resorted to different measures in the South China Sea that we could be seeing right now in the Arctic. And so we wanted to make sure that we were supporting community safety and really getting Indigenous communities intelligence briefings and territorial premiers as well, just to understand the threat and what are the different behaviors we're seeing. That's the first point. Second is we're seeing joint military operations between China and Russia, and joint Coast Guard operations, and that's new. That's been in the last few months.
Right.
And thirdly is middle to long term. We know that Arctic sea ice is melting. We know that ultimately the shortest route between Asia and Europe is the Arctic and our Arctic. And so what we need to do is to make sure that we work with our allies, particularly the US, but also Nordic countries, to protect the Arctic. That's why we're massively investing defense and military equipment and also supporting investment hubs in the Arctic. But also we need to do more understanding in terms of sharing intel with our Arctic allies. And what's different also on our side is, following Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, Finland and Sweden joined NATO. And that created also a possibility for a form of security dialogue, which was not the case before. So today, what we're saying is we're seeing the Arctic a different way. Canada will lead the world in having these important diplomatic conversations. It's no longer a taboo to talk about the Arctic at NATO. It's no longer a taboo to talk about the links between Asia and Europe through the Arctic, and we will act accordingly. So we'll invest diplomatic resources,
Right.
and will invest in military.
Okay, the military. I want to get to the military
Yeah.
resources in a second, but you said in the policy document that Russia's invasion of Ukraine made this necessary.
Yeah.
It proved that it could no longer be business as usual. But they annexed Crimea in 2014. They've been poisoning dissidents, for years. I mean, Russia as a bad actor is not something that we became alive to in 2022. So, I appreciate the need to focus on the Arctic, but it feels like this could have been something Canada started to do after Crimea was invaded.
Well, what is new is what I was talking to you about, which is really Russia's connection to China. And that's why it's so different, because we've long knew the plans of Russia. And I think bit by bit, there was a reckoning that Russia was definitely a problematic country, but Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine changed everything. The Arctic Council at the political level stopped meeting. We decided to have amongst all allies the same strategy of diplomatic isolation of Russia. And so meanwhile, we needed to adapt because the main forum for engagement on the Arctic was always the Arctic Council.
So is the bigger concern Russia's behavior, or is it Russia enabling a stronger Chinese presence in the Arctic?
It's both. Because in the partnership between China and Russia, Russia is now a junior partner. And China has had this long time aim of having access to the Arctic. But Russia was preventing that to a certain extent by having an approach of low tension region. But now this is not the case anymore. And so for a long time, China has said that they were a near Arctic state. They also said that they believe in a Silk Polar Road. And so for us, this is an issue. We need to make sure that we react. And so we needed the foreign policy to be able also to have the defense investments linked to that foreign policy.
But here in the foreign policy, it talks about, in Bill Blair's forward, he talks about we must urgently increase our presence in the Arctic. And you also mentioned how Russia has been modernizing for over a decade it has invested in modernizing its Arctic infrastructure and its military capabilities in the Arctic. The NORAD modernization plan that Canada has, 2035, 2039, 2041 for a lot of these things. So they've got a decade head start, and this country is a decade to 2 decades away from really fully implementing even the modernization of NORAD. I mean, Russia, how do you catch up to Russia to deter it in a meaningful way when they're so far ahead and this country moves slow when it comes to defense spending and procurement?
Well, first you come up with a good defense policy update that invests billions of dollars in new equipment, in new resources, and that puts the Arctic at its core. And that's what Minister Blair announced with the Prime Minister back in the spring. Second, you come up with a new foreign policy on the Arctic that will underpin all our engagement. And that was co-developed with people living the North, Inuit people and Indigenous people. And that was fundamental because they've been used, and I'm quoting Nathan Obed, as flagpoles in the past. And so it was important, as they can be victim of foreign interference and a form of threats, we need to bring them on board to make sure that we had their own interests in mind. And so we changed the approach that we were having with the Arctic. And this is just a new culture and a new approach. So I think we can be strong on defense. And I think we need to do more on defense, to be frank. I'm very hawkish regarding that, but I think we can be very progressive also by engaging Indigenous people and working through a reconciliation process.
No, I get the necessity to do that and to consult with the ITK and the territorial premiers and all of that, but policy and consultation is not going to deter Russia. It's not going to deter China. It's going to be hard power, to back up the soft power. And we're woefully short as a country on hard power, and it is years, if not decades, away from it appearing in the North in a meaningful way, right? So the Arctic policy needs that behind it, and right now it's not there, and it could be a long time before it is
No,
there.
I don't agree. Actually, it comes with all the investment in NORAD modernization. It comes with everything that we announced in the defense policy update with billions of dollars in new equipment, and it comes also with new infrastructure investments.
Right.
But fundamentally also, I must say that the people living in the North are the ones that will be able to be eyes and ears on the ground to help us, to understand what's going on. So that's why they needed to be on board. So I don't see one or the other, David. I see both go hand in hand. Now, do we need to do more? Of course we do. Do we need to accelerate on defense spending? Absolutely. We're doing it, but we need to do more.
But it's going in the wrong direction in some ways, though, right? Like when Anita Anand was defense minister and she was part of the NORAD modernization announcement, the over-the-horizon radar was pegged to be fully operational by 2031. We saw a briefing from National Defense earlier this year. That's now 2033. So already there's a 2-year slippage, right? And things tend to not happen faster in this country when it comes to building up defense capacity. So like when do you think you can accelerate it to have like a meaningful, robust presence, in the northern communities that, beyond relying on citizens to be the eyes and ears, the country has the capacity in the form of hard power?
So this week I was at NATO at the beginning of the week, and we talked about defense production lines, supply chains. We know we have an issue. It's not Canada only, actually. A lot of it is being bought from the US and US companies. So we look forward to working with the upcoming administration because a lot of things we're buying, the 88 new F-35s, indeed the new radars, the drones, a lot is coming from the US, and we want also to be able to be supported in being able to have access to these really important equipment. And that's what Minister Blair is working every day. At the same time, I think that we need to make sure here that we create defense-related jobs. We're investing so much money here in defense. We need to be able to have, like we say, industrial benefits. We need to be able to create jobs.
But that's what slows capability down,
No,
right?
No.
Buying
Wait,
things
let me
rather than
finish.
figuring, okay.
So what we did is we have a national shipyard strategy. And we are the country leading now in terms of building new icebreakers. It's made out of the Davie Shipyard in Quebec. We create this new international forum with the US, with Finland, to make sure that we lead the production of icebreakers in the world. Because ultimately, on the sea, it will be icebreakers that will be extremely important, along with submarines. And we're buying up to 12 new submarines as well. So I think we can do more in terms of creating benefits for Canadians here at home. And that's what we want to do in the context also of this new Arctic foreign policy. And meanwhile, I must say, this is something that President-elect Trump himself is very interested, because he's been concerned about the fact that Russia and China are building much more icebreakers than we are. And so that's why we created this new approach.
So this was discussed a week ago at the dinner table in Mar-a-Lago. The Arctic was. I don't know if the specifics of this policy was, but we've heard positive things from Ambassador Cohen today, but he's leaving soon. We heard positive things from the White House today, but they're leaving soon. Have you heard anything about your specific plans and intentions from the current administration? Because it seems like that's a very important constituency to be happy with what you're doing.
And I really think it's a win-win issue for both of us, because any American administration relies and believes in the importance of Canada when it comes to the Arctic. And any administration right now, including the incoming administration, is facing a very complicated geopolitical scene with many conflicts that are all interrelated, like I mentioned at the beginning. So in that sense, for us to focus also on the Arctic is good news, because it shows that we're doing the work. And I think that is why President Trump has said that it was a priority of his in the context of our G7 presidency. And I think also that I've engaged with many different people from both sides, on the Republican side and the Democrat side, and they see that very, very positively. I've met with many senators, including Senator Elisa McCluskey from Alaska.
Right.
She was looking forward to this. And I've been in contact with many people from the incoming administration, and they see that very positively as well.
Okay, I have to ask you about one other thing, and this was the article that appeared this week in the New York Times, which suggests that you are not only the Foreign Affairs Minister to this current Prime Minister, but could be someone who's eager to replace this Prime Minister when that opportunity is available. Pierre Poilievre has used this to criticize Justin Trudeau, saying he is so weak, his Foreign Affairs Minister launches her leadership campaign to replace him in the New York Times. What's your reaction to that criticism and the suspicion people have, say this article has raised?
Well, I think, my message is clear. Of course, the Prime Minister can count on my support. He can count on my support since 2012 when I was there for his leadership campaign. And when I gave my interview back in July, I was asked that question and I gave the same answer that I'm giving you today. As for Pillai, I think that fundamentally what Canadians expect us to do is to deliver for them. And we're coming up with a tax break that is very popular and very worth it for all Canadians. And Pillai should be supporting us in this tax cut.
So when you did this interview in July, was it, because there was a photo component to it, was this a profile about possible future leader ambitions? What was the intention of this article? Because you're a very savvy political operator. You would have known how this would have been perceived, right?
We were approached by the New York Times. And so we did the interview, period. And at the time, I did also an interview at Châtelaine. How come you're not asking me questions about the interview, the profile in Châtelaine?
Oh, I have not seen that profile in Châtelaine, but I saw this in the New York Times. But, July, when you did this, was right in the weeks after you lost the Toronto-St. Paul's by-election, when people in your caucus were demanding a meeting, and there was a lot of pressure on the Prime Minister and a lot of questions about his political viability. I mean, did that enter into because the assessment of how this would be portrayed? Well,
it is portrayed as a profile, and at the same time, the Prime Minister has no doubt can count on my trust in him and my work for him. And to be frank, David, my job is to be on the international scene, to defend Canada's interests, to make sure ultimately that we exert influence in a world where it is more difficult for middle-sized powers. It is a tougher world. We're working on having a much more tougher response. And that's what I'm doing every day. And I'm talking to international media also when I'm in different countries. That's my job.
Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly, I've gone over time. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you. Pleasure.
So what will this new Arctic foreign policy mean for those northern communities? Ranj Pillai is the Premier of the Yukon, RJ Simpson is the Premier of the Northwest Territories, and PJ Akeeagok is the Premier of Nunavut. And they're all here with me live in the studio. Gentlemen, it's great to see you. It's rare to have a Premier on. Having three at the same time is a treat, so thank you for being here. Premier Akeeagok, I wonder if I can start with you. You referred to this policy announcement today as a historic moment. What makes you say that about this policy?
Well, it's a very important time with what's happening geopolitically around the world. There's really been a focus to the north, and it really allows us to be able to work as northern premiers here, just the ability for us to seize opportunities that are there. As we were talking, there's nation-building opportunities as the policies being brought out for us to really bring infrastructure to the north. Whether it's deep sea ports that really unlock critical minerals, or whether it's opening up fisheries markets that support that blue economy. So the policy is really another opportunity for us to be able to ensure that the voices of the North is being heard.
So Premier Pillai, does this go far enough? Does it go fast enough?
I think when it comes to the investment in infrastructure, what we're seeing with the defense policy, I think everybody wants to see that go faster. And because of what's been happening now with the new transition in the U.S. government, there's the calls to have it move faster. The gaps have been there for a long time. But I also think we want to make sure that the spend makes as much positive impact as possible. So as we talked about earlier, you have to do the procurement in a faster way than we've seen in the past. But at the same time, let's make sure that northern companies and companies across Canada, really this is a Canadian opportunity to see this level of spend when we're talking about $73 billion for defense, as well as some of the other work that's going to be needed to be done just within our commercial infrastructure. So, I think we're going to need to see faster, and I think the consulates that have been identified are a great step in ensuring there's more east-west economic activity. We think a lot of north-south, but it's east-west. How do we make sure companies are moving into Alaska, into Greenland, and back and forth, and build out an economy in the north?
Right. You said we talked about it earlier because this is your second time on the show this week. You're a frequent flyer. RJ Simpson, your thoughts on this? I mean, does this meet the needs of Northwest Territories, and does it do it fast enough? Because a lot of the defense spending we see in the NORAD modernization, for example, we're talking a decade or more from now.
Yeah, so the foreign policy announced today is one piece of a larger component that the federal government is putting forward. And so there's also the defense strategy, and that is really where the infrastructure funds are. And is it fast enough? I think that,
No.
I won't say all of us around the table agree, but no, things could roll out much more quickly. And I think that given, the military doesn't just protect Canada, it also protects Canadians in the events of things like natural disasters. And so with climate change, with these more dramatic natural disasters that we're seeing due to climate change, there's also that impetus. And some investments in support for that area, I think, could come much sooner given the pressures that we're feeling right now.
Right. So just to stick with this, Premier Simpson, there's a lot of talk about Russia and China and the need for a more robust presence and policy to deter Russia and China. A policy document's not going to scare anybody.
Yeah.
We have talked in the past about connectivity, electrification, access to the larger continental grid, and the basic infrastructure to get in and out of these territories. When you hear the urgency to respond to the threats posed by Russia and China, is that what you see in the North right now, the capacity to actually push back against that aggression when Russia has been doing this for over a decade?
Well, we don't have a lot of hard military infrastructure in the North at all. We do have some installations in the Northwest Territories, but I don't think that the military infrastructure in the North is going to be a deterrent to Russia. I also don't think Russia is going to land on Canada's northern coast and trying to launch a ground invasion that way. But there is a need for investment in the North, as you mentioned, in all of those areas that you mentioned, power generation, highways, ports. We're behind. We're decades behind the rest of Canada. And so there's a definite need to ensure that we do have that infrastructure in the event, in the future, so we can be prepared.
Right. So Premier Akeeagok, the conversation is often about dual-purpose infrastructure, right? And I agree with Premier Simpson. We're probably not going to see a ground invasion. I watched Red Dawn as a kid. I don't see that happening now. But there will be naval incursions into territory. There will be planes coming into airspace, for example. Those sorts of challenges. So what are the investments you think can help with the economic development and raising the social standard of living, and also play a role in deterring against bad international actors?
Yeah, and I think what we're talking here is about people. It's how could we create healthy communities, and how, as Canadians, we could play that crucial role. So I'm really excited about the opportunity before us in terms of unlocking dual-use infrastructure that we've been talking about. There's a huge gap between what I think Southerners take for granted to what we have in the North, or the lack thereof, and the challenges that it brings. So we really see this as an opportunity, a generational opportunity at that, to unlock not only the needs of the Canadian Coast Guard, whether it's the Navy or the armed forces, but that of the communities, and how we could support through generational opportunity of investments to unlock the true potential of the North. And I've mentioned whether it's critical minerals that we're talking about, whether it's clean energy, whether it's fisheries, but those are really key areas where there's a huge opportunity, but it will require investments from Ottawa.
Well, you said today that the success of this policy will be measured by the growth and development of the Arctic. So what's a benchmark? What is a metric we can use for whether or not this has been successful, do you think?
Well, the projects we're talking about, to me, you have to make investments. It's one thing to create a policy that sounds great down here, but it's really what we measure is the completion of these projects, these nation-building projects that we've been identifying as Northerners, whether it's the fiber connection that goes to the north, whether it's the deep-sea port. So really, it's measuring the completion of those nation-building projects.
So Premier Pillai, all of these are important. All of these are expensive.
Yeah.
Right? Like it is tough to build in the remote parts of this country. There's an election coming up. I mean, how do you ensure that these priorities last through a political cycle and the possibility of a change in government? I mean, how do you as Northern premiers ensure that this doesn't get shoved aside?
Yeah. First of all, I think the announcement today in the policy there's two really important factors that we have to consider. One is that our circumpolar partners are watching us and wondering, whether they're Nordic states or the U.S. What leadership role are we taking? And I think this lays out a path on some things that we believe we need to do in a statement by our country. But I also think we have to educate Canadians. I mean, we're here today, the three of us, and it's important for all Canadians in southern Canada to understand the importance of the North. Political decisions sometimes get made, not all the time, but sometimes get made where there's more seats. We talked about today, there's 3 MPs in the North. This has to encapsulate the minds and hearts of Canadians. People need to understand in our more populated areas, the same way that we've been able to garner the support from premiers from coast to coast to coast, that these are important investments and they need to support whatever government's in place, not just now, but for decades to come, because it's incredibly important for Canada to take on that leadership role. And there's a positive impact to all of Canada with an investment like this. So I think hopefully the policy can do good work domestically as well as the work as a foreign policy.
So Premier Simpson, what do you need to see in the short term? Because I know this is ultimately a foreign policy, but so much of it is about building domestic capacity, right? I mean, what do you need to see from this federal government and any future federal government to convince you that this is meaningful and to demonstrate real change?
Well, I'll say I've been happy with the engagement that we've had from the federal government on this policy. I've been happy with the engagement Minister Blair has been doing in the Northwest Territories. And so we need that to continue. We need to have that dialogue with the federal government. And we need, like we've heard at this table already, we need to see those investments. We need to see some dollars. We need to see shovels in the ground completing some of these projects. And we need to see communities thriving. You know, one of the core components of this foreign policy is ensuring that northern communities are vibrant, that they're prosperous. Because when you look at somewhere like the Georgia Strait, no one's ever going to consider that international waters because it's built up, there's people there. And so the North, I think that's what we need to see as well, is some real investments that are going to make direct impacts in the lives of the people of the North.
Premier Akeeagok, one of the things emphasized today was and by the presence of Natan Obed from the ITK, how this is a shift, because Natan Obed talked about the development of the North was really tied to militarization of past wars. I know it's a new threat environment that is kind of driving this, but you know, what lessons do you hope the federal government has learned from the way this was done in the past, and how whatever comes out of this foreign policy in your area doesn't repeat the same mistakes?
Well, just when we're talking about Arctic security sovereignty, it really touches me personally. My own family was actually used as Canadian flagpoles for the creation of the community of Grise Fiord, where I'm born and raised. And so from that viewpoint, I think there's a dark history in terms of what Canada had done without the consultation or the consent of Inuit to assert the North. And so I couldn't agree more that we have to continue to see these engagements, and I've been very pleased with the level of outreach we've seen. But when you're looking at Nunavut specifically, we are really at the doorsteps of the Northwest Passage, which we know is at the heart of the policy itself, but it will require really the continued investments to unlock those potentials and to learn from those past mistakes for us to move forward.
Premier Pillai, last word to you. I mean, this is a long time coming, this sort of commitment to doing these things in the North. But it's at a very difficult time in the geopolitical situation right now. The importance in your view of like getting this right, whoever has to deal with this. I mean, what's the big mistake whoever is running the government of Canada can't afford to make here?
Yeah, look, I think they have to have the ambition, and they have to understand that when you look through the history of this country, I think there were some significant projects that are really important that were built at important times, maybe not done to the best of the ability as we can in the current context. But I think if you're listening to Northerners, if you're working with Northerners, we can't be shy at this point. Like, this is a moment to step up. It's critical for us, and we have to seize it as a country. And so I think having the ambition and making that commitment to Canadians is incredibly important at this time.
Okay. Premiers, it's always a pleasure. I appreciate the three of you being able to come in today. Premier Ranj of the Yukon, RJ Simpson of the Northwest Territories, and PJ Akeeagok, Premier of Nunavut. Thank you all for being here today.